everyone, and welcome back to this introduction to cultural anthropology. In this unit of the course, we're going to talk about place, space, agriculture, and anthropological approaches to nature, the environment, and wilderness. So anthropologists understand place as people give meaning to it, and they also are interested in how people in turn are shaped by their physical environment. And there are different approaches to this subject, and in this lecture I'm going to outline 4 different approaches for you. The first one centers on meaning making and storytelling. The second is about ideas and categories of nature, environment, wilderness, and practices of environmental conservation. The third is about an approach known as political ecology. And finally, the fourth foregrounds agrarian politics and practices of agricultural cultivation, relationship between farmers, peasants, landlords, and agricultural workers. Through the stories that they tell about place and places, people tell stories about themselves, about their values, their identities, histories, communities, and they sometimes anchor these narratives in place, and sometimes let multiple layers of meaning and history converge on rocks, rivers, valleys, trees, fields, seeds, animals, plants, and let these meanings and histories change alongside the relationships that humans form with non-human beings and elements. And anthropologists are interested in this specific relationships and in the meanings that they acquire, as well as in the everyday practices. The human experience is situated in time and space, and this is what anthropologist Keith Basso writes in an essay entitled "Wisdom Sits in Place: Notes on the Western Apache Landscape." This was published in an edited volume entitled "Senses of Place" in 1996. And Basso was interested in how people give meaning to their surroundings. And specifically, he was interested in the way people describe and talk about place and how that conveys beliefs about the world and how it's fundamental to how these beliefs are transmitted to others and taught and practiced. So Keith Basso conducted research in a native Apache reservation in Arizona in the 1980s, and he recounted a series of ethnographic encounters and conversations. And through those, he learned how landscape features like trees, valleys, rocks, paths had become places imbued with meaning for the native Apache community, where other members of the community learned how to be a proper person and where people could discuss everyday moral dilemmas and parse them out, and also impart a certain kind of knowledge about how to be in the world to others. In the chapter that you read for this unit, there are a series of conversations and moments where Keith Basso is introduced to local theories of wisdom and place. And one of the story features a group of cattle herders, a group of native Apache cattle herders who are chatting idly, and one of them, a fellow called Patterson, was telling the others that he had been sober for 3 days and he wanted to return to work and have a fresh start and maybe get away from the village where people had been ridiculing him behind his back for his drinking habit. And the others responded with sentences that to Basso, who was present for this conversation, was a fairly nonsensical non sequitur. These men were invoking a place they called trail goes down between 2 hills. They talked about walking back and forth, not being able to see. They talked about burning urine. And in fact, they were making a very clear and understood by everyone else reference to a story. This was part of Apache ancestral knowledge, and there was a story of an old man who was fooled by 2 younger women in this trail that goes down between 2 hills. Everyone in the reservation knew that story and associated it with this particular trail, this particular 2 hills, and a cottonwood tree. And the man used this story and references to this lived landscape to make a moral commentary in response to Patterson's sharing. And that's because they couldn't or they wouldn't critique him directly or scold him for his behavior. This would have been patronizing and condescending. And in fact, Patterson himself had reached this conclusion himself and had expressed his desire to do good, to change. Basso engaged in a long conversation about this conversation with Patterson himself and with his sister. And Patterson's sister explained to Basso that achieving wisdom is in fact very difficult. Wisdom seemed to be a very important concept for her and for other native Apache elders. And so Basso asked Patterson what wisdom meant, inviting a local theory of wisdom instead of presuming that he had a certain definition of wisdom that will be applied universally. And Patterson responded that wisdom sits in places. And so Basso learned about this local theory of wisdom and place from Patterson and other native Apache people. And with Patterson, he learned from him as they sat down, they drank coffee, they talked. That kind of informal anthropological interview that really is an open-ended conversation that invites the interlocutor to explain a worldview in their own terms. So central to this theory of wisdom is the idea of acquiring what Basso's interlocutors described as a smoothness of mind, or the capacity to think clearly. And one gets there by practicing what people called a resilience of mind or a steadiness of mind, eliminating external and internal distraction. And this theory rested on the assumption that nobody is born wise, and everyone has the capacity to cultivate wisdom. And how is wisdom cultivated? It's cultivated through the telling of stories about ancestors and what they did in particular places. Like the story of the old man and the two young women in the trail that goes down between the two hills and on the cottonwood tree. And physically being in these places, in these markers of the landscape, and recounting these stories, this is what transmitted particular ways of thinking about the world and about the self, and about qualities that one person should learn to cultivate. Sensing the landscape and sensing place here also means embodying these collective meanings that are inscripted in places, that are scripted in the trees, hills, springs, and trails through the stories that people tell about those places. Think about a place that holds meaning for you, and particularly that holds meaning that comes from a collective, a community that you are a part of. And think about how that place has perhaps become similarly an embodied metaphor for a certain way of being in the world that conveys a certain set of values, that has a salience. Maybe being in that place marked a transformative lesson or a transformative stage of your life, something that you have experienced yourself as transformative, but something that was imbued by communal values around you. And please describe this place and this transformation, this collective meaning anchored in this place through your own words and writing. So in studying place, space, and landscapes, anthropologists have, of course, wrestled with ideas of nature and the concept of environment and the wilderness. And I'm going to spend some time unpacking those because I think it's important not to use these terms as kind of neutral words. They have a history, they have specific meanings. The word environment derives from a French word meaning surrounding. And in the 19th century, the environment for the first time became that which indicated the subject of the natural sciences. Today, for some people, environment is in fact a synonym with nature. And for others, thinking about environment is more thinking about humans' relationships with landscapes and ecologies. And they might understand this landscape and ecologies quite broadly. They might think of fields and forests, but also oceans and cities and neighborhoods. And when others think about environment, they think about just a space constituted by relationships between different organisms, different forces and elements, and the space where these relationships unfold. So quite distinct meanings of this term. And the term environment, when it's used as a synonym for the term nature, I want to pause here for a second and reflect on what nature means and where this meaning come from, or where these multiple sets of meanings come from. So etymologically, the word nature derives from the Latin word that means to be born. There's a cultural historian called Raymond Williams, and he's pointed out in his essay several decades ago 3 different ways in which European thinkers and regular people have used the word nature. So the first meaning is thinking of nature as an essential quality, the essential characteristic of something. The second meaning is to think of nature as an inherent force, the inherent force that powers and directs the world, a generative principle perhaps. And the third meaning of nature is nature as the material world, and this can either include or exclude humans. So I'd like you to pause for a second and see if you can come up with a very simple example for each of these meanings of nature in your own experience, and other ways in which you use the term nature and what that means to you. In practice, we often use the word nature to mean all three, or combinations of them, sometimes at the same time, which makes it a really complicated concept. And in fact, the concept of nature has also a very complicated relationship with the idea of culture. And in a sense, these two concepts often make sense only in relationship to one another. And you might have noticed this tension over the course of this introduction to anthropology, how these concepts come up over and over again and how they're often embedded in a specific relationship to one another. So when we think of nature in the sense of the material world, the idea of the wilderness might come to mind, particularly in the United States. And the word wilderness is one that acquired a new set of moral and symbolic values in the United States and in Europe, particularly in the late 19th century, where there were certain places like steep cliffs and rocks, waterfalls, mountain peaks that offered, for some, a concrete manifestation of the divine, a concept that was called the sublime, and that invoked really powerful emotions. In the context of European settlers to the Americas, the idea of wilderness was co-constituted or was produced at the same time and concurrent with and related with the idea of the frontier. This is the imagination of a place where white people would go and leave the trappings of civilization and rediscover their primitive energy, reinfused with vigor and independence and all the basis of American nationhood. A lot has been written on the concept of the frontier, so I will not linger here much further, but the frontier, I just want to say, was a world of nostalgia always, right? A world that was already lost, a world of rugged masculinity and wet Europeans. And so wilderness, in this sense, the pursuit of wilderness was considered to be an elite pursuit and a white pursuit. And people who benefited the most from economies of industrial capitalism were the ones who were able to afford to access places of wilderness like private hunting estates, nature preserves, and later on the national parks. And Native Americans dispossessed from lands that would later become national parks and wilderness preserves were often just written out of the stories, as these conservation areas were described and valued primarily as spaces of untouched, pristine nature and later biodiversity. There's so much more to say about this, but I just want to point out that then an anthropological approach to the environment, nature, and wilderness takes them as concepts that are shaped by particular histories and specific histories of colonialism, of marginalization of land users, of marginalizations of indigenous communities, and also that they hold specific meanings for particular communities, and we cannot take these meanings for granted. And so when we study nature, environment, and wilderness, it's important to attend to these different and contrasting meanings of these concepts as they're used by communities and also within individuals. If Keith Basso wrote about the anchoring of moral stories in features of the landscape, many other anthropologists have studied how social cosmologies and subjectivities are anchored or rooted in specific plants and in the cultivation of these plants. And to talk about that, I'd like to go back for a second again to the concept of culture. It has been so important in this course. Culture as a term, in fact, derives from a Latin word that means to cultivate, to tend to processes of natural growth the growth of plants and animals. Think about the word agriculture, right? A closely related term. But it also is related to words that indicate the care of the transcendent, honoring and worship. Think about the word cult. Around the 16th century, in many European languages, culture had come to acquire the meaning of tending to the human mind and human development. And by the 20th century, as we have seen in previous units of this course, culture had come to mean a set of collective beliefs, orientations, and worldviews with distinct groups of humans believed to hold different and distinct cultures. And the notion had been taken away from a 19th century hierarchical idea of culture as civilization, and civilization happening in hierarchical stages. By the 20th century, we think of culture as really distinct people's worldviews. And this idea of culture was static. It presumed that communities were bounded and that cultures were somewhat unchanging. But nevertheless, I just want to point out here the transformation over time of this word and this concept. Now, in the 1960s, anthropologists began to seriously study what they saw as cultural adaptations to ecological systems. They took main concepts from the ecological sciences, fairly new at the time, and they applied ethnographic methods and concepts to it. And this was a field of study called cultural ecology. So cultural ecologists believe that human societies could be studied by applying ecosystem analysis and theories to analyze cultural practices as adaptive responses to ecological change. And these kinds of studies often focus on small, contained societies of small-scale cultivators or hunter-gatherers or fishers. The more isolated, the better, and even better were societies that lived in islands. And they combined ethnographic analysis and quantitative evidence of different kinds of data. So, for example, cultural ecologists might ask how a particular ritual practice might contribute to maintain a balanced ecological system. But in the 1980s, communities of anthropologists, as well as geographers and other social scientists, had developed a new theoretical approach to studying environmental change, relations, and conflict. And they called it political ecology. And political ecology really brought together very different fields, different methods, and different concepts. But political ecologists had a set of assumptions and starting points in common. And in particular, political ecologists were all really interested in rethinking how environmental degradation had been studied until that point. They thought that the cultural ecology approach was limiting because it often presumed that culture was this kind of static, unchanging thing. And they also believed that cultural ecologists often had a certain kind of functionalist scope. They identified practices as serving a purpose, for example, of maintaining ecological equilibrium. And political ecologists also disagreed with various mainstream explanations of environmental degradation. These were, for example, explanations that blamed the practices of small-scale cultivators like Sweden and slash and burn agriculture, or explanations that relied on demographic growth as the main driver of land degradation and environmental degradation and biodiversity loss. And political ecologists believed that this was a flawed approach because it didn't really consider the politics of resource distribution, it didn't consider history of land management and control and displacement, it didn't take power relations into account, and it didn't even consider the effects of trans-regional markets. The basic core of political ecologies is three general interests. One is about foregrounding or taking into account power relations as they play out even at the very local level, so relationship between land users, cultivators, and land managers, landowners, and local politicians. Then the second approach of political ecology is one that follows connections across scale, so connecting these micro-level relationships to processes that unfold at the regional and international and global scale. And then the third approach to political ecology is to take into account longer histories of land use and control. I'm going to show you an example by drawing from anthropologist Sarah Ives' recent work on rooibos cultivation in South Africa. And I like this work because it foregrounds the cultivation of plants as also part of the cultivation of identity, subjectivity, and community. And it situates this in the context of racially inflected resource and land distribution and the inequality of access to land and resources in contemporary South Africa on axis of race and class, the legacy of the history of apartheid, and the impact of national and global markets. Ives' work focuses on rooibos. Rooibos is a plant native to South Africa. You may have had it as a tea. It became very fashionable a few years ago. Rooibos is essential to many South African communities of farmers to their sense of belonging and identity, as Ives found out talking with these farmers. Different ethnic groups in South Africa, in fact, claim to be the proper cultivation of rooibos, and by extension, the proper and the best stewards of the land. And this demonstrates an example in which identities are fairly literally rooted in the land, reminding you that the term culture itself is sometimes a metaphor for cultivation. However, of course, plants, farmers, and cultivation are not static activities, and Ives is pondering on the puzzle of what happens when, with climate change, the zones where rooibos can grow and can be cultivated are shifting, and not all of the farmers can follow the rooibos as the plant responds to climatic changes. And broadly, Ives' research, I think it's a compelling invitation to looking at the politics of nature, and this meaning the politics of making certain things appear natural, appear timeless, appear essential, especially things that are connected to the landscape and that themselves form the landscape, like cultivated plants. And Ives argues that the politics at play here in different groups competing claims to rooibos and to indigeneity is really a politics of South African colonialism and its legacies. So at the time of Ives' research in South Africa, about 15% of rooibos farmers were white Afrikaans, and they controlled about 93% of the commercial rooibos cultivation, using black migrant workers and other workers of color. And black, indigenous, Asian, and farmers of color only accessed 7% of the cultivated rooibos land. And all these groups of farmers of color were also more dependent on rooibos because they often didn't have the resources to diversify their production, unlike the white farmers who had livestock and other crops as well. And their land was typically situated further away from processing centers, roads, and resources. However, all groups, the Afrikaners and the farmers of colors and indigenous farmers too, of course, claimed indigeneity through references to metaphors of having identities fixed in place and connecting their sense of identity to the cultivation of rooibos on ancestral land. And this is something that Ives found out by talking with different groups of farmers and interviewing them. And in fact, the Afrikaners' narratives about white Europeans' mastery of the environment, their superior agricultural skills, and their predisposition and their care for environmental protection served to legitimize colonial conquest and rule in this context and in many others. The white Afrikaners that Ives interviewed often described a landscape that before their arrival was not inhabited by anyone or only by unimportant nomadic hunter-gatherers. And this representation of the land as empty and as underused is frequently used as an excuse for political rule and control. And I'd like to pause here for a second and ask if you have in mind other similar examples of that. So for farmers of color that I've talked with, their own connection to the land was strengthened by their ancestral claims to cultivation, to rooibos cultivation. And this was a response to their historic experience of colonial rule and to their experience of political marginalization under apartheid. Indigenous Khoi and San communities in the meantime had also campaigned for years to receive some of the benefits of the larger rooibos industry, and they had asked to be compensated for their knowledge and for their history. their ancestors had been the first to cultivate and to brew rooibos centuries before Europeans' arrival. And so they asked for a concrete share of the profits from rooibos agribusiness, and in fact they won a big court case just a couple of years ago in November 2019. So I think this research is really interesting because it brings together an attention to place and the meaning of place through storytelling, some of the approaches of political ecology, as well as taking big categories like nature or identity or indigeneity as really lived concepts and unpacking them through local theories and getting at these local theories by talking with people and paying attention to how they give meaning to their practices. This is all for today. I hope this has opened your mind to some of the ways in which anthropologists think about place, nature, and the environment. I look forward to seeing you all very soon to continue this conversation.